Ramadan Kareem, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for coming, and I hope you're so far enjoying a very wonderful first few days of Ramadan. So thank you for sharing this time. It's actually really blessed when you're fasting and increasing knowledge. So we're really happy. This is like the most we've had, in one time. So this is really cool. And thank you for sitting all the way up the stairs, like really cozy.
I didn't know.
Yeah, you guys have the best seats. So welcome. I know that we have a lot of people who have not been here with us before. We did a little bit of a library tour today, so people got a chance to see how big this library is, and also see how it is not ideal in the sense that it's not well organized. It's not necessarily well cared for in the sense of this is not how books should live. They shouldn't live in piles. They shouldn't live in a garage. But they are amazing sources of knowledge. This is our tradition. This is our cause. This is what we've dedicated our life to doing, is preserving these books. And part of why we also started the Usuli Institute, because we feel that this is an important enough effort that we should share it with others and hope that others will also believe in what we're doing and help us to preserve this library, this knowledge, and this approach to Islam. So we call ourselves an Islamic think tank. It was interesting, about a month ago, we were invited to go down to Orange County and introduce the Usuli Institute to a new group of Muslims who hadn't heard about us before. So I started by asking people, I said, we're going to be talking about Sharia and Islamic law, and Sharia and Islamic law in America. And how many people here would feel comfortable saying what Sharia is? And surprisingly, this is an older crowd, primarily, and most people really couldn't do that. These are Muslims. And it's obviously surprising at a minimum, but that's what we talk about here. We talk about Sharia and Islamic law, and what that means in America, how we can live as pious Muslims in our current context, in our current world. We want to elevate knowledge and explore the boundaries of being Muslim and what it means to be Islamic in the modern age. We believe that as Muslims, we should be at the forefront of intellectual exploration, and we certainly want to support our best minds and our brightest scholars in this field, and basically reinvestigate the tradition for our challenges and be relevant for our day and age. And much of this work certainly will happen at scholarly levels. But what does that mean for those of us who are not scholars and who were not meant to be scholars and never will be scholars? Like me, I'm not a scholar. I don't aspire to be a scholar. That is not my gift. That's not my purpose. That's not my calling. I consider myself more a seeker of knowledge, a seeker of the divine, a seeker of truth. And so, for me, questions are important, like, okay, what does Sharia and Islamic law mean for my life and living here in America? How do I live as pious Muslims? How do I, as a pious Muslim, how do I make the right choices? How do I live a moral life? How do I live an ethical life and a normal life? And so for me, the Usuli Institute means something very different. I want to talk a little bit about truth. So we as Muslims are nothing if we are not about truth and seeking truth. And we talk about it a lot. Truth is really elusive, especially now with our new administration and just the way the world is going. And we know that it's really important. But we don't really take the time to necessarily reflect on it and reflect on truth. We feel it. We know when we hear something truthful. We know it. And we certainly feel it when we hear something that's not truthful. I think we sense it deep inside of us. So, I ask, do you know what your truth is? And is there a truth to your existence? Or do you have many truths? So, when I converted 23 years ago to Islam, I had basically two truths. I had my daytime truth, where I've told my story before. I was working at Johnson & Johnson in a very corporate environment. I had, my corporate life. I was definitely not a Muslim. I was not a religious person. I did not talk about God. Definitely didn't wear hijab. I didn't talk about Islam or Muslims. And I would basically pray in hiding. I would go and I would look for an empty office somewhere, and I would pray and hope that no one would discover me. And I was embarrassed. It was like a dirty little secret. My dirty little secret is I was a Muslim. And I was not really sure how Islam fit into my normal American life. So that was my daytime truth. And then my weekend and nighttime truth was being a Muslim at the mosque. So I did wear hijab, and I did pray, fine. I acted differently, I talked differently, I thought differently. And my dirty little secret there was that I had a normal life outside of the mosque, and that I had an American life, and I really wasn't sure how those two blended in. So on top of that, I wasn't really sure who I was. And I wasn't at a point where, I knew what my truth was. And I wasn't really comfortable in my own skin. Today, 23 years later, alhamdulillah, I now, from two truths, I live one truth. And I am so grateful. I am at peace with myself and with being a Muslim in America. I know what that means. I'm confident about it. I'm proud to be a Muslim. I feel empowered to be myself. I feel that I need to live a dignified life. So there are certain things that I will not accept for myself anymore, where I would have accepted those things for myself many years ago, before I was Muslim certainly, but early on also. I know what I'm good at. I know what I'm not good at. I know what makes me a good person, and I know what makes me not a good person. I know what my weaknesses are. And I know the gifts that God gave me. And I know my purpose. And that is a huge blessing. God gives every single person a special gift and a special purpose. So, to me, what the Usuli Institute, or the Usuli approach, or the Usuli methodology, or the Usuli school of thought represents. It's a commitment to finding your truth, speaking truth, testifying to the truth, for God and for other human beings, not just Muslims, and for seeking the divine path. Seeking a path where you can elevate your soul and be the best person that you can be. And it's the approach to finding your way to that whole truth. And we do that through a commitment to dignity and empowerment. So I love kind of turning things around and asking people, how many people, just by show of hands, feel that they know what their God-given gift is? Wow. Okay. Got to start figuring it out. And how many people know what their purpose is? All right. Well, okay. Bye. So this is very interesting. So I have a series of questions for you. Just to reflect. Ramadan is a time of reflection. So let me ask you some questions. You don't have to raise your hands or anything. But first of all, you should figure out what your God-given gift is, because you have one for sure. And you have a purpose. So your question is, are you using your God-given gift? Are you fulfilling your purpose? Are you living your truth? And are you living it for God? And are you living as the best version of yourself? Are you making a difference in the world? And if not in the world at large, are you making a difference in your own world, the people that you touch? And are you developing your relationship with God? And do you have an active engagement with God? Is God your partner in everything that you do? Well, these are the kinds of things that we are about here at the Usuli Institute. This is what we talk about. This is what we try to strive for and help other people find. It's like the truth of everything. And we believe that you have to find your truth and testify to the truth. And we, in our tradition, you've heard people say that if you want to know your God, you have to first know yourself. And that's extremely powerful. That's the way you get to dignity and empowerment If you know your God, and you know yourself, and you know your gift, and you know your purpose, then you can live your truth, and you can do it then with dignity and empowerment. And we do this also through the principles of beauty and reasonableness, which is, very much about the Usuli approach, is that if it's not beautiful, if it's not reasonable, then it can't be of the divine. And God wants us to be godly and of the divine. So what does that look like? So let's start. If you're a Muslim, do you know what Sharia is? Do you know what Islamic law is? Do you know the difference? And do you know how to describe it? Would you know how to answer questions about what it is? And it's presuming that you believe Sharia is beautiful and reasonable. Do you know how to answer questions about what it is? Are you confident in your Islam? And if you're in a room with very nice people, people who are not judgmental, not Muslim, are you proud to say you're Muslim? And do you feel that you can or are willing to answer questions from non-Muslims about beautiful and reasonable Islam? Do you feel empowered to and motivated to literally jump up and perform acts of kindness and goodness without hesitation? Or are you apologetic and worried what someone might think? Are you self-conscious about your quirks, your personality quirks? Everybody's got them. You have a gift and you have quirks too. But are you self-conscious about them? Or do you embrace them and say, this is me? This is how God made me. Are you comfortable in your own skin because you understand that this is how God made you? These are some of the questions that are powerful to reflect on how comfortable you are and how how far you are in knowing your truth. So we as Muslims are, as a people, are the sum total of all individual Muslims. So if we can empower each individual to find that truth and to use their God-given gift to live their purpose, be empowered and be dignified, and work for the goodness of God as a collective, that as a collective people, we can improve ourselves as Muslims. And God knows we need to be better as a people. So we definitely need our scholars. We need our, for our work at the level, scholarly level, we need our scholars to push the envelope of beauty and reasonableness, right? Right now we sort of live in a box. And if you've ever been to the mosque, you know how that feels. Don't do this, can't do that, nope, 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 nope. And our work hopefully will allow that box to get pushed out, so it's a bigger space where we can have more freedom, more dignity, more empowerment. And we need the scholars to do that so that we can claim it, the rest of us can claim it as Muslims. And so that we know how to talk about it. So if someone asks us about our religion, we can talk about it in beautiful, reasonable terms. And that if we understand that, then we can internalize it and seek the divine as we know we should, and then be the best version of ourselves in everything that we do. But we have to do our part. If we're not a scholar and we're a seeker, we have to do our part. We have to learn this knowledge. We have to invest in reading and prayer and learning. We have to recognize that it takes hard work, because anything that's worth anything takes hard work. We have to have a commitment to this path of the divine, and we should be very active and purposeful in affirmative acts of goodness. And what comes with that, obviously for Muslims, is the 5 pillars, prayer and fasting and the other pillars. And so these are the foundations from which this beauty will grow. And that's actually why I am especially excited about today and what we're doing from here. Is we have been talking about starting to lay the foundations for what is the Usuli method, how do we kind of start from the beginning as Muslims on this path seeking the divine, and hearing it from Dr. Abou El Fadl. I mean, if you know his work, you know you're not going to hear what you hear anywhere else. So it's really exciting. I mean, in the years that we've been together, it's just this approach to Islam is like nothing you'll find anywhere else. What we do here, I think, is very special for that reason. And it arises from the library that you saw, from the knowledge, from a lifelong dedication to this work and to, to the tradition. So this is going to be really important for converts. I've in the past talked, in other halaqas, talked about my experience as a convert, and converts do a lot of work to get to being a Muslim. They read a lot, they invest a lot of time, they have to overcome a lot, and they have to put up with a lot. There's not a space for them at the mosque, there's not a place for them in many places. So these sessions that we're doing that are foundational are going to be, I think, a point of validation and tell you that, you made the right choice, that there's beauty here. For born Muslims, I think this is going to be more challenging, but actually a huge source of opportunity, because I can't tell you how many people I've met recently that have told me, I was born a Muslim, but I honestly have no idea where culture ends and the religion or faith begins. And I tell them there's no shame in that. And that's exactly what we're doing here, is we're trying to, literally start fresh. And I would tell people, leave everything that you think you know, everything that you've heard at the mosque, everything that you have questioned, leave it at the door and start fresh. And this is a wonderful opportunity to distinguish where culture ends and divinity begins. And then also, it's extremely important for our youth, because they need to have a beautiful and moral framework and approach for how to live life. It was interesting also when I was in Orange County, I asked the audience there, how many of you are worried about your children and your grandchildren in terms of leaving the faith or feeling like Islam has nothing for them? And literally every single person raised their hands. And it was really interesting. And we know that the youth are leaving. They're finding that Islam is not interesting or compelling or relevant for their life. So that is, the Usuli method actually can, or this approach, encompasses this challenge. And we have a son who's 13. He's upstairs right now hiding and playing video games. He likes the halaqas because he gets to be on his computer without, someone saying, get up. And I'm really hoping, I had these sessions in mind, that I hope that when he reaches that age where he is really ready to dig into, what his belief system is and whether he really wants to be a Muslim or not, that he can start watching these and start from the foundations and learn, what is this faith about and what is the beautiful and reasonable way of approaching. Because, the kids these days, this is like, they face challenges that we can't even begin to imagine with everything, online and just, it's a completely different world. But this is actually then some of the beauty of the Usuli method here. So, for example, in the very first halaqah, the professor talked a little bit about the Usuli method and was explaining that, what we know from, to sort of sum it up in my words, my layman's terms, is there's sort of two approaches to religion, which I would call the top-down approach and then the bottom-up approach. So right now, what we experience pretty much at the mosque is the top-down approach. Somebody decides what is Islamic and is not, and tells us what the rules are. And says, here they are, you follow them. You follow them, you're a good Muslim. You don't follow them, you're not a good Muslim. The bottom-up approach is what the Prophet did, which is he empowered people, like his companions, and knowing full well that after he was gone, people had to operate without him. And what did that mean? He empowered individuals, again, to find their gift, their purpose, their truth, and give them a moral approach and framework, and have an active engagement with God, and create goodness and seek the divine. That's what we're about. And quite frankly, I'm really tired of learning about Sharia at the mosque from lay people, from doctors and engineers, business people. I recently heard a khutbah where a businessman was trying to teach people about Sharia. So, I'm sorry, I'm not allowed to get irritated when I fast. But I have to say, it did definitely irritate me. Because, he took a swipe at experts, and he was like, well, experts, they talk at this level, and, it's really complicated and whatever. you know, we don't really need that. We know that Sharia is simple. It's just about goodness, you know, and then proceeded to like say very confusing things where I'm like, oh my God, okay, you're confusing everything, but fine. And, you know, sure, yeah, and in one sense, Sharia is about goodness, yeah, absolutely. But how do we live, and how do we make decisions when things get hard and things get complicated? You know, what happens when the rubber meets the road? So if you have cancer, how do you weigh, should you run after every treatment possible, regardless of the suffering? Because, you know that God wants you to do everything that you can to heal yourself, and that, you know, that there's a solution for every problem, whatever, you know, the medical, there's a cure for every illness. Versus, you know, versus giving up and accepting the will of God. Is God going to hold you accountable because you didn't go after all the treatments that are available and you didn't try every experimental thing under the sun? You know, that's a real question that we got. And what happens if a woman, when she wears hijab, it causes her depression and it makes her want to leave the faith and hate being Muslim? Should she still wear hijab? You know, what about abortion? You know, when the kids are diagnosed as being very ill and you really don't know what they're going to be like until they come out. Or interfaith marriage, or fasting in high altitudes where you have 20-hour days. Do you still have to fast? Or can I get a mortgage?
She's plagiarizing real questions we got.
These are real questions that we get every day, and it's complicated. You know, I'm sorry, the businessman at the mosque is not going to be able to answer these questions. You know, and this is like what happens to you after you die. You're going to be held accountable before God. Do you really want to know how to handle your soul and your hereafter by someone who's not qualified and hasn't spent their whole life dedicated to studying God's law? Do you want to trust your hereafter to a doctor, an engineer, a computer scientist, you know, a physics major? So
do you?
Do you? So, okay, so, you know, this is what we do at the Usuli Institute. So we have, you know, we have work that we want to do at the scholarly level, and we need that. And we have work that we need to do as seekers of the divine and seekers of knowledge. We want more freedom to operate. We want to live in our time. We want to be relevant. We want to be inspiring. We want to be examples. As Muslims, we're supposed to be the best examples of humankind for humanity, not just for Muslims. And I don't think you're doing that. But that's what we do. So now it's Ramadan. If you like what we do, you have to support it financially. I am not a fundraiser. I don't even like asking my parents for money. But this is like, you know, if you like what we do, and you don't find it anywhere else, I'm telling you, it's not anywhere else. You have to support it with everything you have. Not one time, but ongoing. You have to get everyone who wants this view of beauty and reasonableness in Islam to give everything that they have. We recently became aware of an effort to raise $350,000 so that the Muslims can have their own float at the Rose Parade. And Muslims got excited about it. And I'm like, what? $350,000? We can do so much good with $350,000. And people are willing to do that. They're willing to invest in these kinds of things. Please, people, you know, we have serious things to do. And we need your help. We can't continue. You know, this is our cause and we love it. But we cannot get very far or do very much without your support, your financial support. You know, we went down to Orange County and, you know, wealthy people, they were not interested in supporting us very much, which is a really sad state of affairs because all those people have children and they have grandchildren and they're worried about the future of Islam. I mean, if you're worried about the future of Islam and you want something beautiful, then invest. You know, it's, we now are, your zakah here is, or your donation here is zakah eligible, so you can give your zakah here. And we're also nonprofit, so now you can get a tax write-off too. So how much is that future worth to you and your kids? And thank you very much.
Oh, Grace, I always feel like I can't match your energy. it's a downer. I'm a downer. But you know, it's this is my least favorite part because I want this institute not to feature me, but to feature others. But nevertheless, thank you all for coming. Now, the challenge is that people here are, well, you're fasting, so, you know, I'm not expecting your intellects to be 100%. That's always. But people in the present context are at very different levels. There are some people who are quite advanced and some people who are not, who are beginners. And so it's a bit of a challenge to build cumulatively until I have a structure in which you have the same people on a constant basis, and you start building cumulative foundations for them. So I was thinking hard about what I should cover today, and the journey of imparting what the Usuli method is about. I want to put this on hold, or the structural aspect of it on hold, because until I know the audience sufficiently well, otherwise we're doomed to keep repeating the same material again and again, because people come in and go out and so on. But I want to, sort of following Grace's sunnah, I'll follow, I'll share with you a living example, a personal example, if you will. To state the obvious, we're all human beings, including myself, you know, with all the materiality that goes with that, and the challenges of materiality and physicality that we are created, blessed with the divine spirit within us. We all carry the breath of God, and with all the magnificent, wonderful implications of that. And we're all also placed in an immediate challenge, and the challenge is our sensory abilities and our sensory dependencies. And the more you surrender to these sensory dependencies, and your life is nothing but some product of your sensory experiences, the more you are unable to tap into the divine within you. So I usually spend a considerable amount of time usually night, in dhikr, remembrance of God, where it starts out by simply repeating the glorious names of God, the beautiful names of God, but then develops to an ecstatic state where I invest in the partnership that I have with Allah. And each one of us must build a partnership with Allah. As we all know, as the Prophet ﷺ said, that you take one step towards God, and God takes 10 towards you. And as we we know from the Quran that God is close, ever close, answering your call. And to the extent you don't feel God in your life, it's because you have not invested in God. But to the direct proportion to your investment will be your yield. No, God is not in books of hadith. God is not in law books, as much as that hurts me to say that. God is not in philosophical texts, although these do exercise my intellect and expand my intellect. But God is in your supplications and in talking to God directly. The challenge, though, and this is what the following Greece's son I'll share with you, is that the world often sucks. And so you spend the whole evening in dhikr and reach an ecstatic state, and then you wake up the next day, or actually, I mean, I don't know if I wake up, that's debatable. But you're assaulted by just layers of ugliness, and you long for these ecstatic moments of sheer beauty. So here is from last night to tonight. I just was hearing all the material about, and I don't know, you might have already aware of this. George Nader, there's a man called George Nader who's a rather, he's a Lebanese businessman. He has a reputation of being very slimy. He's extremely rich, made his wealth from unclear venues. Seems to be involved as a middleman for a lot of influential and corrupt human beings. But do you guys know about this? What George Nader did?
No.
You've heard? So George Nader, for those of us who know this businessman and his shady dealings, no one deals with George Nader unless you're a certain type of human being. He's not going to give anyone that knows God the time of day. Let's put it that way. But so George Nader, it turns out that he acted as a go-between between the Saudi royalty and the royalty in the United Arab Emirates, particularly Abu Dhabi, and the Trump administration. 6 months before Trump was elected, to communicate to the Trump administration the support of the Saudi family and the ruling family in the United Arab Emirates. And the investigation, I guess, might reveal more, but typically the way these things go is that he will also negotiate particular financial deals, some of them which have actually come to materialize after Trump's election in the rather infamous deal with Saudi Arabia that was in billions of dollars, right? Now, the thing is, if you remember, Trump at the time was engaging in rabid Islamophobic talk, right?
Yeah.
He was maligning Islam and Muslims left and right. And in fact, announcing publicly that he will ban Muslims from coming to the United States. Now, I've got to tell you that before this, about a year before this, there's all these various stories coming out by journalists that work for The Guardian and Reuters and so on, that Saudi Arabia, the guardian of the holy sites, and the United Arab Emirates were funding some of the Islamophobic industry in the West, actually promoting the Islamophobic industry in the West. You know, I'm, as a lawyer, I was very, you know, I suspended judgment and thought, well, let's see what the evidence is, and it's something that, like a lot of history, we know history after it's all done. But it definitely, the involvement of George Nader in negotiating this deal with Trump and the role of Islamophobia is consistent with the idea that Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries have a vested interest in the Islamophobia industry, and it's quite. I mean, it's think about the you know how giddy the devil must be, the devil and his minions, the devil and all the little other demons. You know, this is amazing. This is wonderful. You get the Christian right, the Jewish extremists, wrapped up with the guardians of the holy site, with an egocentric maniac who pays off prostitutes, and you all come together in this amazing deal to control the world. I mean, I've, you know, I can't claim that I saw the devil, but I could literally feel the demons celebrating and, you know, yelling cheers, you know, up to your health, and stuff like that. Now, so why do I mention that? Because I mean, what is the interest of Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf countries in the Islamophobia industry? And the racism part, they don't care about. I mean, whether the American administration is racist, they've never cared about. And they themselves have their own racist outlooks. If you're a white man, you're first class in the Gulf countries. You're treated like royalty. I mean, if you're a white man who's Anglican, so if you're a white-skinned Syrian, you'll be treated like garbage. So that doesn't count. Right? If you're like Swedish or British or American or something like that. So the racism part doesn't concern them, doesn't interest them at all. But of course, you know, we've talked in these halaqas about Islamophobia because it is a very important historical moment in our lives. So much in the world is unfolding in direct response to this rabid hostility to Islam at so many levels. I mean, you might have heard about the French insane effort to edit the Quran. They want to publish the Quran was edited, you know. But the interest, and I won't, you know, the interest of places, the guardian of the holy sites with its allies in Islamophobia is that it keeps the American fervor to sacrifice life in defense of these governments existing. If there is Islamophobia and you think Muslims are demons, you will be willing to serve in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Iran, wherever you're told to serve and to die for it. And the existence of military troops, military bases in the Emirat, in Saudi, in Oman, in Bahrain, is necessary for these people to maintain power. So, I mean, it's not a puzzle. It all makes sense, right? It's all the league of the devil working together. Now, where the challenge, though, and I'm here again, I'm just sharing with you my own little journey and my frustrations, is how to find God in the midst of this remarkable ugliness. Right? I mean, God told us, God is the ally of those who believe and will transport them from darkness to light. Now, this idea of light is critical, and it's critical at so many levels, and we could talk for hours upon hours upon hours about this. But finding the light of God and connecting to that light in the midst of these layers of darkness is a real challenge, and it's a challenge that all of us wrestle with all the time. As much as we engage in the world and find layers of darkness, if you are unable to detach yourself and to reconnect to that source of light, you end up truly losing perspective, losing your past. You end up not sure what is of good and of bad, what is right, what is wrong. You end up being a human being who's not anchored in anything. You know, as the Quran describes it, you end up being like someone that as if you are in a frenzy state because you're possessed by a demon. The state of emotional and psychological instability and uprootedness is because we often respond to the cumulative and layered levels of ugliness that surround us. But at the same time, you know, remember what Hannah Arendt had said about the banality of evil. We either contribute to a luminous state of existence, or we contribute to the extinction of luminous states of existence in the affirmative way that we carry ourselves. So what is my response? Of course, I'm not talking about, you know, when I'm in the office, I'm not talking about law, I'm not talking about sitting down and writing an article about all this ugliness. If I do, I'm not sure, it depends. I'm not talking about being invited to give a lecture or something like that. But what is my fundamental and basic response when I'm left alone and I go home and I'm sitting in my room alone? I'll tell you exactly what I'll be doing tonight. I'll be running back to dhikr. I'll be running back to the remembrance of Allah and reconnecting with that light. The Prophet ﷺ, one of his most often repeated dua, the Wahhabis don't like to remind you of that dua, but we have cumulative sources that this was an Allah give me light. Give me light. Ij'al li nuran. And make light between, and bestow light between my hands, and light between my eyes. And it goes on, light in my ears, light, and so on. So in other words, surround me with light. Now remember some basic facts. And I'm not a physics guy, well, that's sort of a lie, but that's my entertainment. I do the physics and for fun. I'm obsessed with dark energy and dark matter, but that's a different matter. That's not what I do when I'm not worshiping and I'm not doing law. I'll take my other Khalid, my Qareen, who wants to be a physicist. He's a frustrated physicist. You know, the nature of matter, right, is vibrations. And I'll tell you, I mean, we Muslims, when the Prophet ﷺ tells us that prayer is nur, as-salatu nur. Prayer is light. In fact, it has a rhythmic state that we repeat in rak'ahs and in prayers that puts us in harmony with existence. It is something that we if you want to explore it, I mean, we could talk about it in other halaqas, but Ibn Arabi talks at great length about the relationship of prayer to the vibrations and the impulse, the pulse of the earth itself. Now remember that all of existence is vibrations. The difference, I mean, roots of physics we can prove. Yeah, what is the nature of matter?
I mean, it is on a state, but yeah, motion.
Yeah, motion, right? That's a basic fundamental thing. And so when we covet light, of course we're not talking about the something that just moves at this particular speed, but it is exceeding the limits of the physical state that we exist in. In its heart, in its fundamental essence, when we talk about Islam, we are talking about longing for the divine and experiencing the divine that is already within us. I mean, we all, most Muslims who've been Muslims for some time know the hadith of the Prophet that whoever knows himself knows his God, right? And that hadith, although again the Wahhabis have spent a considerable amount of effort to try to say that it is unauthentic and that the Prophet could not have said it, there is an equal amount of effort by Sufi schools to defend it. And I believe it is authentic. I mean, I believe it is actually core to the faith, beyond a matter of authentic. That this is not an indulgence of subjectivity. It is the resistance of simple materiality. It is the insistence on not surrendering to apathy, banality, and darkness. That whatever states of darkness exist, because if you think simply in logical terms, the nature of evil will dishearten you to the point of apathy and depression. If you sit here and you think in logical terms, compare the wealth of George Nader. I mean, I don't know how many of you actually know about George Nader, but he owns, I mean, he's destroyed a lot of lives around the Middle East. And, well, anyway, there are a lot of George Naders in the world. Of course, more important than now, George Nader are the people that he does business with, like Trump, and like the Saudi royal family, or at least parts of the Saudi royal family, the ones of them that are not in jail now. The nature of evil is that it really dissuades you and uproots you, and it disheartens you, and throws you into the depths of despair and apathy. It is only the light of God that can lift you and basically tell you, as long as you glow, as long as you are glow with light in your existence, in the time of your presence on this earth, the material consequences do not matter. In other words, logically, and this is, by the way, when people turn to violence and become suicide bombers and terrorists and things like that, they make the mistake of thinking that they are responsible for the consequences, the results. This world belongs to God. And if God would have willed, he could, as the Quran says, what happens in the final day? What does the Quran describe the way everything will end? Do you remember? God will end it all as if closing a book. It's a remarkable expression. It's as if all of this reality, which is not a reality, but is only reality through perception, right? So the way we interpret things, the way it will all come to an end, it's as if a book that God will just fold up. Just fold it up. Ultimately, that's God's business. God can wrap it all up, close the book. You're only responsible for it's one thing, it's a huge thing, but it's also a small thing. The wonders of paradoxes, right? They're beautiful by their nature. That's how the nature of beauty. It's like the nature of music itself. It's the tension that creates the flare of beauty. Is that your job is to glow as a luminous substance in the period that you exist on this earth. You leave the consequences, the results, the sum total of what happens to God. It's not your business. You are not here to win victories, or to keep score, or to score points against the other side. You are here to connect with the divine. Now, believe me, once you connect with the divine, your entire perception of so much of the way you impact your... So, people don't come seeking my help and they say, oh, I'm just with the divine, go away. Because once you connect with the divine, you realize that goodness, what Grace was talking about, goodness and beauty, must shine outwards like the rays of light. It by its nature, it's in a state of motion and in a state of giving. And it never shines inwards. It's against the very nature of light. So I don't forget anything. Let me... Yeah. Oh yeah, okay. So let's go back to الصلاة نور والصدقة برهان والصبر ضياء. The Prophet ﷺ, this is, for those of you who are, okay, I'm going to forget the anana. Does anyone understand? You know what anana is, right?
Yes.
So I'm going to forget the anana and this thing is.
Anana.
So the Prophet ﷺ said, prayer is light. And sadaqah, giving alms, donating, is burhan, is how do we translate burhan?
Confirmation. Evidence.
Evidence, affirmation, confirmation. We'll explain it. وَالصَّبْرُ ضِيَاء, and patience is a glow. Now, this is one of these hadiths that have engaged me a lifetime. Because you can read it, but teachings of the Prophet, leave alone the Quran, are not there to be read and comprehended. They're there to be absorbed and achieved. Right? So, giving is evidence, as we know from another narrative, that giving is either evidence for you or against you. If you are unable to separate from your material belongings, with the exception of books, I don't lend books, I don't give books. I take, I don't give. So my sadaqah doesn't extend to books, but everything else but books. Food, clothes, you know, you can take whatever you want except books. Knowledge, you can take drugs. You can, I don't know, but then I don't know. You have to put up with grace. It's just, that's something else. You know, but seriously, the sadaqah is, and that, if because it is in direct proportion to your attachment to materiality, is your inability to give to material things. There are human beings, and this is actually, as we know from various sources, that human beings are often very generous, could be generous with their time, could be generous with their smiles, could be generous with their words, but their relationship with money is the relationship of shirk. It's like idolatry. So many people in truth worship money, and that is the most difficult thing to part with. But we all can intellectually understand, at least, even if we cannot achieve it, that the ability to give is evidence of your piety, of your Islamicity, of whether you are a Muslim or not, in the true sense, right? Whether you're a believer or not. Because if you truly believe, you see material possessions in the right perspective. And you see that you are simply placed in a relationship of guardianship over whatever Allah, whatever God makes you in possession of. So in other words, whatever money you earn, you're simply a guardian over this money. You don't own it. Does everyone follow? So, this is sort of very elementary stuff, but I'm assuming all of you know about it. Anyone wants me to elaborate upon that? Okay, good. So, with this relationship of guardianship over material possessions, we all understand it, and if you, it will testify either for you or against you in the hereafter. And we know from various other reports from the Prophet ﷺ that not only that, but you will be told that, you know, these $1,000, this $100,000, in the case of Trump, this $100 million, or in the case of George Nader, this $1 billion that ended up with was actually intended for this person, this person, this person, and you failed to give it to them, and these people, you owe them in the final day. And that's a horrible position to be in. I don't want to owe people anything in the final day. None of us do. But prayer, Salatul Nur, prayer is light. To get to the point to experience prayer as an exercise, an absorption in light. Now note the relationship between this and sabr, patience, as diya is what? The glow that comes off from light. It is what is the word I'm looking for? It's a physics word. I'm spacing out.
Luminosity.
Refraction.
Luminous.
Refraction.
A refraction.
Luminous.
Both are right. But so patience, the essence of patience is perseverance. And to experience prayer as light is not possible. Is not possible without perseverance. Now, how many of us have actually experienced prayer as light? It could come as a gift from God in a moment, as a hiba, you experience it in a moment in time, and then you long for it. Or you could practice it until it becomes at your command. Now, why am I emphasizing light? Because, as Imam Ghazali told us, and I'm don't get it. I'm blanking out, so let me. I don't want to just say the essence. I want to say the actual words. Yeah. ذا الروح نور من أنوار الله وجماله. This is the Arabic. We, الروح, the spirit, the soul, is but a light from the beauty of God. And actually the narrative continues خلق الله الخلق في ظلمة ثم جعل في هذه الظلمة من نوره. That darkness is what exists without the divine. God intervenes in this darkness by creating light in creation. The other by generating, by initiating that state of light. God is light, as we know from the Quran. God describes God's self as light upon light, right? And then we get into a lot of wonderful things about whether it is that the layers of light and whether they act as a shield for the truth of God that no one has ever seen or can possibly, or I mean, okay, this is more in the mystical tradition, and maybe much further on we can talk about it, I don't know, depending on how much you actually, how much of you will come back or run away or whatever.
Disappear with light.
Yeah. Or vanish in the light, or end up being abducted by demons or aliens, or everything is possible. By the way, the aliens are just jinn. All that fuss about the aliens, they're just jinn. They're doing their business. They've been doing their business before we ever came to this earth. Just let them be. Jinn are jinn. They're cool. They're in the sea. They're in the air. They're in the planet. They're fine. They don't bother you unless you bother them, by the way. Then, as the Quran says, then they will torment the heck out of you.
I just realized that aliens and illness is the same.
But I didn't think of that.
It just came down to me when you were talking.
How did I get it on aliens? Other than
Abductions.
The
Abduction.
So I was reflecting about what will happen to all of you back in my life and what will not. But I might, Allahu A'lam. But the point is that whether we go at what layers of explorations of the lights of divinity, I will tell you that the lights of divinity are endless. I mean, I'm talking about my own little journey, as incomplete and deficient and inept as it is, and Allah knows how defective I am at so many levels. The layers of the beauty of the divine are endless, and the more you experience a layer, the more you realize how much you've experienced nothing. But it doesn't come, if you're sitting in prayer and you are aware of what's itching you, that you have a yawn coming up, you have a hiccups coming up, you have your nose is running, you're not there. What happens is that you lose sense of your physicality. It's as if you are engulfed in this light. Now, is it unusual for Grace started talking about Islamic law. Is it unusual for an Islamic law person to talk about this? Absolutely. But is it unusual for an Islamic law person to train in this? Absolutely not. In fact, I will tell you, we corrupt law. We use law for entirely corrupt purposes unless we first connect with the divine, with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, at the luminous level. Because then we fail to understand what the law is there for. The law is simply a function for what the divine wants, not of human beings, but for human beings. Now, why am I, again, I started out with the ugliness of the world, because law is often a very poor tool when it confronts ugliness at the scale. What is law going to do about the slaughter of 60 unarmed people in Palestine? And I don't know if around here TV didn't show any of the horrific injuries. I mean, you have people who are basically standing around, and children, and bullets, exploding bullets, just blows up their arms or their legs. And then we have our administration's response is, well, it's their damn fault. Have you guys heard it?
Yes,
Yeah, I mean, it's their fault.
it's Hamas.
I mean, that is, as Hamas didn't send these people to demonstrate. I mean, what does law do in light of a world that can witness, I don't know if you followed the abuses that are being committed in Yemen. Horrific. I mean, we have reports of forces, Saudi Arabian forces and UAE forces putting people under a heated plate and skewering them. And I work. I mean, I'm working in the human rights field, so I get cumulative reports. Now, this is the point where you must be able to differentiate between the divine and the luminous, and the demonic and the ugly. Because if you don't, you become like an Eman, is an oscillating human being that has no rudder and no moral compass. You can say I'm a Muslim and at the same time praise what is fundamentally unethical and immoral. The Islam that I know cannot stand for the unethical and immoral. It is impossible. It's a contradiction in terms. Islam and ugliness cannot meet. I'll go even a step further. Sharia and ugliness cannot meet. You know, I got attacked about this several times, but you know, Ibn Qayyim has in his I'Lam al-Muqin a very nice, on his third volume, I think it's around the beginning of the third volume. In my younger years, when I had a photographic memory, I used to be able to tell you the page and the paragraph. But, you know, a lot of things go as you get older, and among them is memory. Alhamdulillah. As much as your body goes and your memory goes, your ability to reach the divine increases. So alhamdulillah, it's beautiful. What was I talking about? Alam al-Waqi'. You know, when he talks about Sharia and he says that Sharia is it's whatever, if there is injustice, if there is ugliness, cannot be a part of Sharia. وَإِنْ أُدْخِلَ فِيهَا بِتَأْوِيلٍ. Of course, this is an aspirational statement. Another, in philosophical terms, he's not speaking deontologically. He's speaking ontologically. In other words, the abstract idea of Sharia itself is that by its nature, it cannot accept ugliness. Now, whether in application Sharia sustains the ugly or not depends on your ethical makeup, the ethical implementers of Sharia. If you are of the ilk that on the one hand, right at the same time that the Palestinians were being massacred in cold blood, and I've been reading reports about the injuries of a lot of these children, and it's just it's horrific. It's horrific. And the suffering is horrific. I mean, to find a child who has a bullet exploded in his shoulder, and there's all this bureaucratic fussiness. The Turks wanted to take him on a plane. The Egyptians wouldn't allow, because of course the Egyptians do the bidding of the Israelis. They wouldn't allow the Turkish plane to take him. And then they went on haggling for 3 days whether he can be transported from Gaza to a hospital in Egypt. And then the Egyptians said, we'll take him, but we won't allow his parents to come. And then the parents said, well, we can't leave our child. I mean, it's horrific. At every level, it's ugliness. Well, do you know what at that time the guardians of Islam were doing? They were checking whether the taste of Zamzam water changed or not. I'm not kidding you. At the same time that the massacre was going on, we had the Wali al-Ahd Saudi tasting Zamzam water and said, oh, I detect that the taste has changed. Are you guys doing your job? And then we had a whole conference about whether the Zamzam water. If you do not have the moral rectitude, the luminous substance in you to see the ugliness in this, then this is not the place for you. And we have a fundamental disagreement. I mean, I pray for you, and pray for me. I don't hate you. May Allah bless you. May Allah bless all. Again, hate and Eman do not mix. If you truly have Eman, you can't hate. You don't know what hate is. And it's not, people, it's not dogma. Once faith, Eman enters your heart, it's like a cleansing element. It cleans your heart. It cleans your soul. It cleans your eyes. It cleans your tongue. You're not attracted anymore. You want to know whether you have enough Eman or not? See if you're attracted. If what is ugly attracts you. If it attracts you, then you need work to do. You have work to do. If it doesn't attract you, you have still work to do, but a different type of work. You need to be reading Ibn Arabi and Jilani, and then we need to talk about the journey, because you need to go on to higher elevations of consciousness and being. Now, I will give you my conviction, and I've said this in several halaqas, but people keep coming in and out of the halaqas, so there is cause to repeat it. Now, why Islam? I've said this before, and I'll say it again. In my view, and we can talk about this if you want. We can talk much more about this if you want. Islam is the only truly monotheistic religion per the message of Abraham, and all the Abrahamic prophets that have come since then. Judaism has proper monotheism, but tribal identity got mixed up with the monotheistic faith. Christianity has monotheism, but it confused the Trinity that comes from Hinduism, and the Trinity that comes from ancient Egyptian religions, and the Trinity that existed in Roman culture was imported into Christianity. And in doing so, it vitiated a very basic and fundamental principle of monotheism, and that is your individual accountability and responsibility. That no one pays for your sins, and no one can elevate the burden of your sins from you. You are responsible. There are no excuses. No one will be able to come in and intervene on your behalf when you are held to account. The monotheistic message of Islam is the monotheistic message of the Prophet Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and that is when Muslims talk about the corruption in the message, forget all the stuff you hear from people who don't know what they're talking about. Fundamentally, what it is that reversion to the fundamental principle that there is one source of light in our existence and one source of light in creation, and that we carry that divine luminous substance as human beings without differentiation as to race, gender, or anything else, and that our accountability and responsibility as to what we do with that luminous substance and that divine substance within us is individual. And so when God deals with you as a responsible adult. That's why you're not held to account until you reach the age of maturity. And that's why if you lose your mind or you're psychologically ill or mentally ill, there's no accountability upon you anymore. Because God says, I give you my most amazing creation. And we've talked about this. What is the most amazing creation? The intellect. The intellect. God has not created anything more, as we know from the Islamic tradition, that is more wondrous and more amazing than the intellect. And you being given the intellect you've been given it all. Now, to the extent you numb that intellect, either alcohol or drugs or video games or stupidity, because stupidity can numb the intellect, you're committing a grave sin against yourself and against God. But that intellect is your path to your salah becoming light, but the instrument to that path is patience. As in sabr wal istimal, because it will not be achieved if you're like a lot of, one of the one of the things that I was infected with upon immigrating to the United States, and I had to spend years trying to get it out of me, is when I came to the States, I learned impatience. Alhamdulillah, in Egypt, we'd go to finish some papers, and we sit waiting for the guy to show up to put a stamp on our paper, 6 hours. You learn patience there. You just sit, and 6 hours until he shows up, and then say, please, may Allah bless your mother, bless your father, bless your neighbors, please put a stamp on it. Come back tomorrow. You come back tomorrow, and you wait another 6 hours. You learn patience, alhamdulillah. Yeah. You learn other things too, but you learn. In the United States, you come, it erases the virtue of patience out of you. You learn impatience. And I learned impatience in the United States. I wanted things fast. I even got into the McDonald's Burger King for a while. Scene. In other words, I was single and,
Addiction.
who cares? I mean, it's like, okay, whatever, they're gonna feed me fast and just. But I revisited with my shuyukh and I realized and I had to cleanse it out of me again, because without patience you have nothing. That's why it's a diya. Okay, I'll stop here. Oh, it's the luminosity. Patience is your luminosity. It's your path to light.
What's the difference between sabr and istibar?
Istibar is perseverance in patience. It's an active form of the exercise of patience. We should pray and then yeah. Shall we pray first?
Yeah.
Or no?
Yeah.
What time is it?
It's 5:11.
Yeah, we think pray Asr, take
Yeah.
a little break, and then come back and do Q&A.
Yeah, because it would also give me a little break.
Okay.
Yeah.
You know, usually when I'm doing this, I'm gulping down cokes at the same time,
Cafe.
and I'm cokeless. Cokeless. That's by the way, that's haram. I know I'm going to answer to Allah on the final day about my consumption of coke. I ask Allah to forgive me all the time. I can't tell you how much time I spend every night begging Allah to forgive me for my dependence on coke. Pray for me that demon is lifted off me.
Mine is the ice. I do the same with ice.
Is ice?
Yeah.
That's
You know,
water.
No ice, not cold water, real ice.
But
Makes me feel like
that
I'm in
doesn't
heaven.
have caffeine. It doesn't have all the destructive
Diet
stuff.
Coke is
People,
different.
Diet Coke
Yeah,
is
right.
it's
Ginger
harmful
ale.
For the teeth. Yeah, it's destructive.
And
Well,
then
bad
I'm
drink
just
water,
worried that
people.
Allah will come on the final day and say, I gave you this body and your consumption of food damaged this, damaged this, damaged this, and then I will be held to account for it. And I'm just praying that I've done enough good to balance that out. But ask Allah to forgive me, please. Beg Allah to forgive me for it.
A gentleman that comes wrote to me, that about the coke. He needed to talk to you about it, and I said he knows everything about it. You don't need to tell
He
him.
would just be rubbing my guilt. I already have enormous guilt as it is. I mean, I know I'm sinning. I know I'm a
gluten free.
my wife makes me feel guilty about it all the time. No, I'm not actually exaggerating. Yeah. Actually, she's a sweetheart. She doesn't. She's just. It's funny when we first got married. There was a rumor going around that she controls me, and I don't know. I think it was because it was a Chinese married to an Arab, and she's really beautiful, and I look the way I look, and everyone thought, why the heck did she marry him? Actually, we know someone, family, who told her mother, she's really pretty, why did she marry this guy? And so everyone said, well, she must control him, and we would always chuckle about that, and it's like, oh, you control me. Yeah. She's
Not the coke.
She lets me get away with murder, including staying up all night and, Thank you, I really appreciate it. Okay. Let's get ready for stuff. I just want to mention, maybe these are just follow-ups. We know that Allah says in the Quran that when Allah describes those who come to Islam, مَنْ شَرَحَ صَدْرَهُ لِلْإِسْلَامِ, the description, فَهُوَ عَلَى نُورٍ مِّن رَبِّهِ, what is this action, what is coming to Islam is being in a state of light. Again, نُورٍ مِّن رَبِّهِ, light from God. So the correlation, that relationship of luminosity and light, and it's not just a literary artifact. It's not just a literary expression, but the key to Muslims who have been able to explore the layers of meaning, it is to investigate exactly what is this relationship of attaining light through belief and action. Not belief alone, that's not want to do it, and not action alone. Because action alone can be like busy energy, but it doesn't have a purpose. So I mean, just the other thing I on the idea of dhikr, the remembrance of God, and being in a state of dhikr, we all have read in the Quran the repeated references, فَاذْكُرُوا اللَّهَ ذِكْرًا كَثِيرًا, the repeated references that to the remembrance of God as the means, the ways to the attainment of enlightenment and the attainment of this light within. Now, the remembrance of God is not, the dhikr is not simply the 5 prayers. That's simply the foundational, the basic minimum that you do in order, and think of, and I've given a whole long lecture about this a long time ago, but think about the amount of time that you invest in another person to get to know another person, just a human being. You cannot claim to know, when you often try to know another human being, the first thing we do as human beings is that we often project ourselves onto the other. We because we're egocentric maniacs in essence, right? And it is only through humility and discipline and interaction and careful listening and more humility and patience that you don't project yourself onto the other and get to know the other as they are, on their own terms. And it is not possible without humility, without patience, and without the investment of time and energy. Now, transplant that to God. Why do we think that we are entitled to the knowledge of God without the same constituent elements? Humility, patience, investment. Because the first thing we do with God is that we project onto God what we are. We make God into our own image, and and that is why quite often, if we're vindictive people, we think God is vindictive. If we're angry people, we think God is angry. If we are whatever, if we're people that want to be stars on American Idol, we think Jesus is, making sure that we are stars on American Idol. I'm always amused by the first thing people who make it through some singing show, they say, thank you, Jesus. And if Jesus has nothing better to do than to make sure that you go to the next stage on American Idol. I'm sure Jesus has, considering all the suffering in the world, there's other things to keep Jesus busy. But nevertheless, we project ourselves onto the divine. And it is only through humility and patience and the investment of time do we get to know God not simply as an image of ourselves, but God as an image of the totality of creation. So you get to know God even in the dog that you've never met, in the bird that you've never trapped in a cage. Eventually, you see that it's repugnant to God to trap a bird in a cage, but that's another thing. You get now. That is why one of the narrations from the Prophet ﷺ, I'll say it in Arabic first because it helps me translate it. لكل شيء سقال وسقال قلوب ذكر الله. To everything is what anchors it, what makes it weighty and real. And what anchors hearts, سقال القلوب, what anchors hearts, what makes heart firm and rooted is dhikrullah, the remembrance of God. And this, again, put aside the anana. If you don't know what anana is, it doesn't matter. But considering the how much has been commented, not in modern works, but in pre-modern works, on this image that your heart could be, lightweight. It could be an anxious, we as human beings, we can feel conceited and arrogant and content very easily, and we could become undone and anxious and completely discombobulated very easily. Now, what anchors the heart in something firmer than that? It is your relationship to Allah. That's what dhikrullah is. And this is not just theory, it is those who have practiced it will testify to it. Cumulative testimonies. They know that they neither become arrogant and conceited when things are going their way, nor do they become undone when things are challenging and frightening, because they're always tranquil in God and with God. Again, now, notice that as I feel a tremendous amount of anxiety and, well, anxiety, I don't like the word anxiety because I don't feel that anymore, but the sadness about the realities that surround us in the world, including a president who would need a lot of this hadith. He has a heart that's, I think, is like on a
He doesn't have
speed
one.
or something.
He doesn't have.
He
That's
doesn't
what
have
He doesn't have one.
He also doesn't read.
I was
so-
telling myself.
And he hates Muslims, and he hates Arabs, and
He
He
hates
hates black people.
he hates black
Mexican.
people, he hates Mexican, he hates anyone of color, of any type of color. And of course Muslims, and so the minute he knows that this is something the Prophet said, he's probably do the exact opposite. Okay, may God... Yeah. But anyway, the point is that you can see evidence of what happens to people when they don't anchor their heart. And it's including people who claim to be religious. And that's the part that we underscore, is that simply carrying the label religious doesn't mean that you have a weighty anchored heart and a rooted heart. It is what you do with this claim of religiosity. Whether you develop a relationship with God, whether you can claim to have that relationship. And it's not possible without humility and the investment of time and effort. You can't take God for granted in the same way you can't take your wife or husband, or if you want to keep your wife or husband, if you want not to end up hating each other or divorced, you can't take them for granted. Why do you think you can take God for granted? But God doesn't come to a person through blind obedience. God is not some tyrant master who, and that is why I dislike intensely when Muslims say, I heard someone recently give a khutbah and said, we are God's slaves. We are slaves to God. No, we're not. We're not slaves. How dare you use the word slaves? We're not slaves.
Because of Habib, no?
Yeah, because he means Abid. But
Habib comes also from Abel.
We are worshippers. We praise God. We're not slaves. He's confusing Abid, the Abd who's a slave, and the Abd who's a worshipper. And anyway, okay, so now I'll keep quiet and take your questions.
So what are some of the means that you do dhikr with? How do we do dhikr?
The preparations.
These guys filmed me. I'm laughing because I can't lie about it now that they have filmed me doing it. Okay, so I started out with, I mean, this is like concealing the sitter, but okay, so because I'll tell you what I can tell you. First, I started out with the ordinary prayers that, you know, until I am satisfied that I've achieved focus. So how much do I pray? You know, it doesn't matter. How many rak'ahs, it doesn't matter. But then after the rak'ahs, I will sit and I will raise my hands and I will first enter into Alhamdulillah, subhanallah wa bihamdih, subhanallah wa bihamdih, and keep repeating it until I feel that I've reached a state where I can start another line of dhikr. Then I do sujood for prolonged periods of time, and during those sujood I will talk to God. Then, once I've reached a certain point, I walk around and do dhikr as I'm walking. And sometimes rock back and forth. But I am physically there, but I'm not there.
And you repeat words when you're going?
I have a whole, I mean, I can, if you read, I can write it down for you.
Like
I have a
tasbih?
whole, if you write it down, it comes to about 50, 60 pages. You know, but I use what I want to talk to God about.
Is it possible to have a session of dhikr one day? Inshallah.
Yes, I'll do I will not, there is a certain type of dhikr that is so private that I will not share.
Yeah.
But I will share with you all the stages before I get to that point where it becomes very private. Yes, I mean, just I would need you for an evening because I usually start late at night. I kept these guys up till
3 a.m.
So it just, you have to have the attitude of martyrhood and forget about sleep and food.
Yeah, well, in the last 10 days,
Oh, that's true, yeah,
we can do that. No
inshallah.
Is there any significance of walking, or just like make that something like physical after sitting?
Okay, I had a wonderful sheikh who spent 20 years of his life in prison at the times of Nasser. His name is Adel Eid, Sheikh Adel Eid. And I often 20 years in prison in a mu'taqal. He was never sentenced. He was 20 years in a mu'taqal, just never sentenced. Just one day they opened the prison and said, okay, go out. And so I would always ask him, how did you persevere through these 20 years? And he said, I was in a constant state of dhikr. And he taught me that everything is in motion. And if you want to replicate the nature of creation, be in motion in your dhikr. He's the one that trained me to do that. And it works. Now, Sheikh Muhammad Ghazali used to be extremely stable in his dhikr. He wouldn't move an inch. He would just sit. And I would see his lips moving. So I can't invalidate in a particular way, but we know that those who reach the height of the so-called twirling dervishes, they replicate the motion of the cosmos, and so it's not an accident, it's not a coincidence. In Egypt, a lot of the tariqas, they will not repeat the circular motion of the cosmos, but they will swing back and forth like a pendulum in their state of none of it is just accidental. It's all purposeful, and it all follows a methodology. I will never claim that I have a methodology that works for me, but I am not a master, and I'm not I am not nearly close to being someone who can teach a tariqah to anyone else. I just have what works with me. Yeah, so I would suggest that I can help you to learn the tariqah of real masters, but not mine. It's not worth being called a tariqah.
First of all, I just want to thank you for having me here today. This is my first time. You mentioned earlier why Islam, and I think you gave a very compelling argument. One thing that I encounter in society now is not so much why Islam, but people ask why religion. Even if they do believe in God, they question why religion. So I'm just interested in learning from you what kind of benefit you think religion provides to society.
Well, I don't. Part of the issue that I have is what do you mean by religion? Because often the idea of religion is, if by religion is meant a methodology that is based on the cumulative wisdom of generations of people, we can try to reinvent a methodology every other day, but it is unwise. Every time we've tried to forget the cumulative interpretive wisdom of past generations and rely on basically an idiosyncratic exploration of the individual, by the time a person's life is over, if they even make it that far, they basically discover what they could have learned from the inherited wisdom of past generations decades ago. And so idiosyncrasies and individualism is attractive in that it gives the veneer of independence, but all knowledge, all wisdom is cumulative. I mean, can you imagine if we dealt with medicine or mathematics or any field by basically saying, well, why use what others have discovered and what others have learned? Now, what a lot of times when people tell me why I don't want to follow, or I am against religions or organized religions and so on, let's separate between that person who actually has done some effort to understand what religions are, and the person who basically is using this as a trope, as an excuse for idiosyncrasy and laziness. I mean, in other words, they want to indulge in their own whimsies, and it sounds cool because that's the age we're in. Every age has its cool discourse, its cool language or symbolisms. And right now, this type of individuality is cool, where you say, I'm so smart and in touch with myself that I don't need anyone's inherited wisdom. I beg to differ. I mean, you would have to be level of intelligence that I haven't met yet to convince me that you really don't need to learn from the cumulative insights of past generations. Now, so I mean, so many kids say that, and I just look at them and say, oh yeah, okay, fine, go do your thing, whatever. Because they're just, they think they're being really smart. It's like people say, they start talking what they think is philosophy. And to me, it sounds pathetic. I mean, if you really read philosophy, it's stupid. They're even contradicting the very first rules of logic. And if they read a little bit of logic, they would realize that what they think is insight is actually just dumb. People have said it. True intellects and true thinking and true philosophical insight has gone light years ahead of them. They just don't, they're lazy, they don't want to read. Okay, so let's separate that genre from people who actually have done some thinking about religion. And then the issue is, if by the fundamental thing in our relationship to the extent we have an organized religion, and although Islam doesn't have an organized church and doesn't have an organized, there is an organized methodology and pedagogy and an organized system of discourse. But the critical issue is your relationship with your own individual autonomy. And to what extent do you relinquish, now we don't ever relinquish this autonomy unless we're being threatened by force, like someone's putting a gun to our hand. And then at that time we can say our will has been prevailed upon but most times what we're talking about is a presumption. In other words, I am going to defer to you in some aspect of my autonomy based on the belief that there is either an implicit or sometimes explicit relationship in which I defer to you because of my belief that you are privy to some truth that I'm trusting you with, right? So in other words,
It's an epistemology of trust.
Yeah, epistemology of trust, exactly.
Like, everything operates like this, like
Yeah,
science,
absolutely.
math, like, you defer to the expert.
Yeah, you're deferring because of an epistemology of trust. And so, and that's, now, here's where we come to the crux of the matter. Now, notice, because we're then talking about reflective people, we're thinking people, not the cool idiots. So then, in that situation, I say, well, so much of existence functions on the basis of that epistemology of trust. Do you ever relinquish your autonomy to the point where you don't retain the right to critical insight? I would strongly advise you not to, because that's how abuses within religion happen. That's a cult, or where you have some priest abusing, taking advantage of sexually or whatever, because you basically stopped thinking and gave your right to hold one accountable for whether they delivered on that epistemology of trust or not. In Islam, if you're doing things right, you never reach that point. No one has the right to say, just obey me because I talked for God. And that is my fundamental disagreement with what I call the Wahhabi methodology, is that it engages, I see it as a fundamental breach with the historical theology of Islam, because it basically says, I I have some relationship to the wellsprings of divine will, and I don't need to be held accountable to you by showing you the evidence, and I take away your right whether to accept the evidence or not. And I don't think that's possible within an Islamic theology, that we ever reach the point where someone can tell me, I no longer give you the right to say, I don't believe your evidence, because it is elementary within what I call the Usuli method, with modifications, is that you always have the right to see the evidence, and you always have the right to say, I don't accept it. So, and here is where I say, if, you know, then that's a fundamentally different conception of what often people mean by religion, because without the, I mean, and I use epistemology and trusted speaking in God's name, in one of the books that I've written. Human society doesn't function. I mean, even when, you know, even when we engage in the, you know, those same, I teach a course on rebellion and law, and it's sort of a radical course, because we start out with the question of why should we ever obey any law, right? And then we unpack what laws are. And really, we investigate, you know, what does that mean to someone command us? Why do we listen to police, other than the fact they carry a gun and they can shoot us? You know, let's assume that a police officer doesn't have a gun and won't shoot us, you know. You know, wide assumption. But that's, I mean, we actually, to take an actual hypothetical we use in the course all the time. You know, you drive an abandoned street, whatever that woman that comes talking to you on the computer, in the car, Siri, you know, tells you no cops around, no hazard, you know. Yeah, and you know, there's a red light, and do you stop in the red light? You can see there's no car anywhere in sight, and it's, you know, let's say in a town that only has one light, and maybe even, let's make it even, you know that you're the only car in town, okay? Do you stop in the red light because it's a law, or you don't? And so, how did I get there, other than the fact that I'm reliving my course? Yeah, oh, no. I actually love this stuff, and I teach a whole course about it, and that's all we do for the whole semester, and it's amazing. Because it unpacks that issue to what we often then, as we start interrogating these questions, is how much of our life is based on this relationship of cumulative trust, and what defines society, and what defines all relationships, including our assumptions about what a girlfriend or a boyfriend or a husband or a wife or a fiance or a mother or a father or an uncle, everything. And so, you know, like a lot of things that sound cool, it's just that, they sound cool, but there's not much beyond that. Don't forget the people on the stairs, by the way.
Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Okay, let's go all the way
They're
over
hidden
to
from.
Honey.
Dr. Abou El Fadl, can you talk a little bit about like the cumulative maturity level or maturity of Arabs here in either the U.S. or SoCal?
That's a loaded question.
How can you
Okay,
generate?
I'll tell you. I'll tweak it a little bit in a way that I'm more comfortable with. So, you know, one of the things that really next year, inshallah, I'm teaching a course on Islamophobia and the law, and I'll tell you why I mentioned that. I often watch Jazeera has a program called From Washington where it interviews a lot of Arab Americans, and it interviews people that I know are from the Arab American community. And one of the things that really gets to this issue of, I'm not sure maturity, but race consciousness is one way, is that their remarkable reluctance of so many, including the institutional Jazeera and people like Shibli Talhami and the people that so many of them, to accept the discourse of being a racial minority that is racially discriminated against. In other words, the racialization of the problem of Arabs in the society. And because that's a level of legal maturity, political maturity, civic maturity, to understand that what the history of this country is, and the role that race plays in it, and the ways that race and religion are, intersectioned with each other, and the reluctance of, at least at the level of leadership, to accept that themselves as a racialized minority and a discriminated minority, and in many ways to aspire to be white. To think that if they just perform enough whiteness, they become treated as white. And it's not going to happen. And it hasn't happened, it will not happen, it will never happen. You will never, regardless of how much, and some of the white performance that I see on part of the leadership, I'm not in mass communications fields, I'm not going to teach a class on communication, but I wish I could, because I wish I could just show clips of so many interviews by so many American Arab intellectuals that appear in Jazeera, and the extent to which their discourse shows this desire to perform whiteness and become white, somehow transform into white through that. And that, when I talk to, when you talk to people in other accounts, you say, well, it's a new immigrant community, it takes immigrant communities to a long time, but considering their history was colonialism, I don't think it's as simple as that they're just a new immigrant community. Because there's a long history, colonial history, in which the colonized populations imported and psychologically embedded the biases of their colonizers. And I see that in the immigrant community. That's a different issue than the way that intersects with Islam and Muslim issues. It's complicated. But I see that as a very serious concern. I don't think it's a coincidence or it's an accident, the number of Arabs, many of them Muslim, women who want to marry white men, and Arab men that are marrying white women, and then like that dinner we had where you hear complaints about the Arab men don't want to, it's like there's a serious race issue, and that goes to that issue of maturity. Now, I am overall, I always look at, we don't have, since Edward Said passed away, we have a few intellectuals that are, for the most part, isolated, and their influence doesn't extend to the community. In other words, they're academics, they do great work, but they remain within their academic circles, and the only one that I think came close to sort of having a cultural impact beyond academia was Edward Said. But Edward Said, of course, was not a Muslim, and so he was in the Arab circles. But we don't have any. No, we have a serious intellectual problem. I mean, and I'm talking about Arabs. You know, there's Arab Muslims and then Arab Christians, and they have different issues. But Muslims have a very serious intellectual problem, and Arabs have a very serious intellectual problem. They're not exactly the same, but there are a lot of overlap. Does that answer the question?
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I keep to as close as I can with that because that's a very complicated question.
It is.
We have serious issues. We have serious issues. Part of it is that if we can accept if we can understand our racial role, I think that will get us some ways. I mean, then at least we can start forming alliances where we need to form alliances, and stop seeking the approval of people who will never approve. I'm being very political.
Let's send the stairs to the question. Go ahead, please.
So, I've recently been reading your book. I'm almost finished with it, Reasoning with God, and the section on which you touched on the history of what you label as puritanical Salafism, it touched me personally because I was raised in a household where those ideas were basically the norm and afloat, and for the past 7 years I've been kind of deprogramming myself from a lot of what I was raised with. And I guess my question is, how do you, from what I've noticed is this trend of puritanical Salafism seems to have tainted everything and everyone, even people who are not conscious of its existence, who wouldn't say, oh yeah, I'm not Wahhabi or I don't agree with that ideology. They're still on a subconscious level tainted. So my question is like, how do I as an individual, like, I don't know, like, or kind of start anew, like a fresh start, and like how do you combat this trend and this like viewing religion like black and white, like you just need Quran and Hadith and that's it? And
yeah, I mean, that's a good question. First I want to say something about puritanical Salafism because you're a brave soul that you're reading Reasoning with God. You know, the publisher told me this book is too long, shorten it, and I said no. Keep in mind that what makes the paradigm of the Puritan is not an absolute equation. It is within a historical context, meaning that there is a certain epistemology that could have been quite reasonable in a different historical period, that when you place in a different historical context, it becomes entirely unreasonable. And that is, the issue is not the Salaf, because all of us are Salafis to one extent or another. All of us look to the example of the Prophet and the companions of the Prophet, and the family of the Prophet, and we study that moral example, and we try to distill from that moral example as much as we can in order to guide our own lives. What made the great scholars great in previous ages, what made Hamid al-Ghazali, or what made Juwayni, or what made Ibn Rushd, or even, you know, even what made even a Shafi'i, or is that they mastered the epistemology of their age. When they studied logic, logic back then was Platonic logic or Aristotelian logic, and that's what they mastered. And I am sure that if they existed in our day and age, they would have mastered the logic and the epistemology and the system of knowledge of our day and age. So what makes a puritanical Islam is the insistence on an epistemological paradigm outside of its historical context, and then taking it as if it is a code of law that you simply plug in and plug out, as if it's a vending machine. You put the right amount of money in and it gives you whatever, Diet Coke or whatever. So now, and that's what creates the paradigm of unreasonableness. And the unreasonableness that we all suffer from then as Muslims, as we read text and then want to faithfully execute this text and find that we are out of touch with the deontological, to use the philosophical fancy term, realities of our age. In other words, the applied moral principles of our age. So, first and foremost, and because I went through a phase when I was younger, I went through a phase where my mother was a kafir, my sister was a kafir, my father was a kafir, my brother was a kafir. I tried to get the Jama'ah to come recruit my brother. He jumped out of the window and ran away from them. And then he told me, your brother is a kafir. And I went home and told him he's a kafir. And, so it was really cool. We're all kafirs. Okay, so I will tell you what my first sort of melting down experience that I've had is that develop a relationship with Allah, develop a relationship with Allah, develop a relationship with Allah. I mean, do the 5 prayers, but that's the minimum. Beyond that, cry. Get to the point where you talk to God, cry, complain, do whatever you want. You want to yell, yell. You want to, take off your clothes and jump around the room as you try to do that. Talk to God the way that you would feel God responds to you, whatever it takes. One of Muhammad Ghazali rahmahullah, he told me, it says we hide the narratives of the Sufis, like we don't tell our students about the narratives of the Sufis and what they did to talk to God, because if we reveal them to the students of this day and age, they would be scandalized. And this is quite true, because it's in Islam, in its age of enlightenment, people understood that you have to develop a relationship with Allah. That's the premise of everything. Then, second, beyond that, keep in mind that there are Sharia cannot result in a situation of ugliness or injustice or suffering. Now, if you find suffering or what you suspect is injustice, and you cannot reconcile the evidence, the textual evidence, with the empirical reality, then suspend judgment. And just say, I don't know, but I will protect my Eman by saying, this doesn't sit well with me. May Allah educate me one day to be able to reach a resolution. Now, we know that the great sages would suspend judgment as much as 90% of the issues. We are just pompous human beings. All of us are arrogant human beings. It's a part of our modern condition. We want to be judgmental about everything, but that's the the puritanical itch is that you want to judge everything. You want a black and white answer about it. You don't want the humility of saying, maybe I just am not qualified to judge this. And and the stronger your relationship with Allah gets, the more comfortable you are with saying, I just simply don't know enough to judge. And there are things that you can clearly judge, because there are clear points of injustice and suffering. A lot of things, but there are things that we just need to study much, much more to judge. So that, relationship with Allah first, and the humility of suspending judgment second. If you work on these, it will resolve itself. And of course, at the younger I don't know how old are you. You look very young, but it might be just your look.
I'm 24.
Okay, you look younger than that. Congratulations. That's but 24 still. The older we get, the more life beats us down, and the more we accept that we can't judge. Just as the natural, Allah intended it this way, because for Allah to give young people vigor, Allah needed also to give them a little bit of arrogance, so they can go change the world. And then as they get older, they need to settle down and not get divorced and things like that. So then Allah takes away their arrogance, so they can be good husbands and good fathers and stuff like that. So I made sense of the entire world for you, see?
So like real quick, because of that influence I had growing up, like when I hear about dhikr or like tariqas, Sufi, I have this like inclination to like kind of dismiss it, I'm kind of suspicious and skeptical of it. Like I view it as a sort of like superstitious, like, oh, is this like the Muslim version of speaking in tongues? And I recognize there's...
You are right to be skeptical, absolutely. And you are right to be suspicious, because your relationship to Allah is too precious and too important to just blindly surrender it to anyone. And I will be the first to tell you, there are a lot of fraud in the mystical paths. A lot. A lot of people that claim to be mystics are nothing but other than frauds. Now, having said that, once you develop a relationship with God, if there is a master in your path who is willing to train you to attain higher levels, then you will know it in your heart. You will not need to ask anyone. But I was told this repeatedly, and this is why, I'll tell you, I've never joined a tariqah. I've visited all of them and never joined any of them, because the teachers that I trusted always taught me to be very skeptical of anyone that tells me just obey. And my relationship with God doesn't tell me just obey. I really never learned that. I don't, that's why I have a problem with police officers. I just can't just obey. I don't know how to just obey. Anyone, of course, it's different when I submit to God because I love God. And that love, obedience, or doing what I know, it's a harmonious relationship. You find yourself in it. It nourishes you. It doesn't oppress you. But so yes, be suspicious. And there's a lot of fraud, a lot, and you know, I know someone who here used to be in Orange County. This was back in the 80s. Some of you were alive in the 80s. But back in the 80s, there used to be a guy who would come to LA and go to Orange County, and he would go to your house and say, "Give me your credit card," and he would. You would be out of the tariqah if you asked him, "What do you want? Why do you want the credit card for?" You know, yes, there are a lot of. So I mean, the guy who gave you the credit card was telling me, you know, "Aren't you proud of me? I gave him my credit wrong. I didn't even ask him." I said, "You're an idiot." But I don't know what happened to that guy. I don't know if he's still in the U.S.
I don't know what you call tariqa. What is tariqa? No, I
Uh,
know the word, but
it's a
what do you-
mystical order, like the Shazlis and
Shazli,
Aksha, you know.
They
But
call
I
it
don't
tariqa?
wanna-
Of Sufism.
But there are many. I mean, there are many. Like the issue, the order, yeah, mystical order. But there are, like, for instance, the methodology of the Naqshbandis is entirely respectable. The methodology of the Shazli is entirely respectable. Rifa'i is entirely respectable. But the issue is that there are a lot of people who claim to represent the methodology and abuse it, and especially in places where there aren't established institutions where you can go and you can ask about, you know, is this person truly someone who's advanced or just someone who's insane? Because a lot of times if you're advanced spiritually or insane, you sort of overlap. You resemble each other outwardly. And you know, there's certain circles where in a country like Egypt, you know, everyone will give you a full report about everyone else. But in the US, you can get away with murder. People do get away with murder. So, or England, which is another country where there's a lot of abuses.
Any more questions? Go ahead.
Going back to the dhikr part that you were talking about earlier, so the practice of dhikr, from what I've noticed, is, you know, a lot of people who follow Sufism, that's where it comes from. So it was inherited from sheikhs like Usuli or Jilani. Was it originally like inherited from Ahl Bayt, Prophet, from there, and that's how the practice continued? Or is it like just a Sufi school?
I mean, there is a lot to say, but there was no one more intensive in his zikr than the Prophet ﷺ. Now, of course, the Prophet was a prophet, so none of us can. I mean, the fact that he would continue praying until his feet would swell and start cracking. Who among us, seriously, can pray until their feet swells? I mean, you know, we say it, but okay, try to really imagine it. So many people reported that the Prophet would continue praying, and when they would tell him, or Aisha would pray until, you know, she wouldn't be able to stand up. She would need a rope. She would, you know, put a rope under her armpit to prop her up. Who among us does that? So when whether through the line of Ahl Bayt or the line of some of the companions of the Prophet, you know, they would come. I don't think any of them claimed that they reached a point of dhikr or as much dhikr as the Prophet himself, because of how, and that's the amazing thing is that, you know, when they would tell the Prophet, you know, you're a prophet, why do you need to be in this constant state of remembrance of God and worshiping God and so on, and say it's out of gratitude and now what is elaborated and built upon is the various people that carried Islam to various places. So I mean, I was just reading yesterday, the companion that took Islam to Oman. And he was quite influential in the various permutations of dhikr methods in Oman. Now, this is often a mixture of folklore and collective inherited memory. So, I mean, like all folklore, it gets added to in various levels. But as there are various methodologies that work for some and not work for others. So, when I tried the twirling dervishes, all I got out of it is that I got extremely dizzy. It did nothing for me. Now, I know someone who's actually came to Islam or converted to Islam through the twirling dervishes. The minute she found the twirling dervishes, it's as if she found the meaning of life. She just continued twirling and twirling and twirling and wouldn't stop and fell and twirled and fell and twirled. And, may Allah bless her. That's her. So now there is an academic history and the collective inherited history. Often academic history doesn't interest me because academics impress each other. I'm much more interested in the folkloric history. And the folkloric history is often much more telling about why, for instance, the twirling dervishes went through certain geographical paths, why it never took hold it took hold in certain areas of Egypt in certain forms. So our twirling dervishes in Egypt. But that's a very difficult tariqah to get into. Do you have them in Iran?
Yes, we do.
You do, right?
Yeah, we do have orders. Mystical orders in Iran as well. Yes,
but no, I mean the practice.
The twirling
yeah.
practice?
Yeah.
No. Just in a very limited regions of the Kurdistan.
The very interesting, the Egyptian corruption is that it was, there is a twirling dervishes in the Sufi order, and then there are these twirling people that are used in weddings. They just dance in weddings. That's nothing to do with mysticism. They just get paid to.
Right.
Very bizarre. I mean, that's just a uniquely weird Egyptian thing where somehow.
That's not connected to any kind of mystical originally?
No. There are, but they have nothing to do with each other. It started out. They bastardized it. Yeah, it started out as a, but they exist, but it's very tough to get into a twirling, or it's much easier to get into one of the twirling orders in Egypt. Any of the Shamsi orders, they don't even work with the Association of Sufi Orders, which is recognized by the government. You have to have wasta upon wasta upon wasta, connections to get anyone even introduced to. I mean, that's a very interesting history, but I don't think anyone has researched it. Sort of like just word of mouth. Anyway. How did we get into that topic? Who was it that? Was it you? You were
talking about
yeah,
and things like that. So basically today's world, when you look at Sufism, they're the ones who tend to speak and practice dhikr more than any other school of thought. Or that's why I was just wondering.
Before the modern age, Sufism was the predominant form of Islam. I mean, not necessarily everyone belonged to a tariqah, but if you read Hamid al-Ghazali's Ihya Ulumuddin, I mean, you see it very clearly. And the demonization of Sufism was a distinctly an oddity in Islamic history. I mean, the idea that, which Muhammad bin Abdul Wahab raised, that he came to fight the corruptions of Aqidah because all Muslims have gone astray. It was specifically an anti-Ottoman rhetoric. I mean, it was and it was also historically completely incorrect. It's not true that by the time that Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab came into existence, all Muslims have gone astray except for the Salafi movement, and that the people in Mecca were worshipping a tree and they needed Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab to bring them back to the faith. I mean, unfortunately, a lot of quote-unquote Muslim liberal reformers jumped on that bandwagon because they thought that Al Saud can replace the Ottoman Khilafah in an Arab Khilafah. But I mean that's it was of course fool's errand, and they didn't pay enough attention to the fact that the whole Al Saud venture was a something invented and the whole taking of Hijaz by Najd was invented by colonialism. I mean, it was a completely colonial venture. It was necessary to destroy the Khilafah and to. Anyway, I mean, next thing they're going to say Abou El Fadl, it belongs to the what is that called?
Hizb al-Tahrir?
Or Hizb al-Tahrir or the Islamic State Khilafah. I'm talking history. I'm not talking about politics. That's just historical realities, whether you like it or not.
He likes to be taught at school.
Yeah, that's not the way, of course, we were taught. We were, we were raised in Egypt, and the Ottomans were evil. We were liberated. The big Arab Revolution liberated us from Ottoman dominance. It takes a lot of reading to overcome what they assign in school.
I was not even taught that.
You weren't?
I was not even, no.
Oh, you weren't even taught about the Ottomans?
No, we were taught, but not as evil and this and this and that. So it was a Catholic school, so the Islam was very mild.
Oh, because it was a Catholic school.
No, but we had our class of Islam, Taban, of course.
In our history curriculum.
The curriculum of history, yes. The history.
They were evil, of course. They were evil. They were oppressed us.
I thought in Islam, okay.
Because I spent years reading, and the irony is that if you want, I learned that history at Yale, where I started questioning the Muqarrarat al-Ta'lim from Masr.
Wow.
I started saying, wow, it's not, as the story goes.
I'm relearning everything. Like what he said, I think what he said is great. Because it's very good to relearn and restart, in his own way.
But once you open the door of wanting to learn, it never ends. You'll end up with a home like this, and
or a smaller one.
So just keep reading, and then the more you read, it's like, oh my God, I don't know anything. Okay, I'll just stop after this book. And then you read more, it's like, oh my God, I still don't know anything. Okay, I'll stop after this book.
Isn't it in the Quran also that God says you have to ask questions and you have to doubt and you have to wonder and you have to... All this is like a part of, the order is not just following...
That's the ethic of the inquiry of learning. We can talk about the role of... Because that's underscored in that's an entire pedagogy of the Quran. The call to reflect and ponder and investigate and search. And I mean, and I've read enough to make the statement at this point in my life that I don't know of any other religious book. I use a holy book in trying to be objective in the sense that the claim of holiness, including a wide variety of religions that has emphasized thinking and reflecting and questioning as a value as much as the Quran. It is a unique feature of the Quran. But that's a different topic, because I don't like saying it rhetorically. I'd like to say it and then demonstrate it. And in the context of comparing it to other texts. Because that's a very unusual feature of a sacred text. But anyway, that's a different topic. What time is it?
7:05.
7:05. The food just arrived, but we still have a little bit of time.
You still have an hour.
No, it's not.
I have a funny story about the policeman if you want me to say.
Does anybody have any more questions? Oh, Anthony did.
Oh yeah,
Sheree.
speaking of
Okay.
just because of Ramadan, I was just wondering what the I guess these Usuli approaches or explanation for why we're actually fasting in the first place, because I feel like, you know, I've been listening for a while and I've sort of developed my own sort of internal reasons for why, but like, you know, when you're asked by non-Muslims, hey, why are you actually doing this? I think it's not sufficient just to say like, I don't know, well, it doesn't really apply to me because I don't have any like Muslim family or whatever, but it's like, oh, you know, my family does this or, you know, blah, blah, blah. So, yeah, so, you know, why exactly are we doing
You know,
this?
Muhammad al-Ghazali, rahmahullah, I once asked him, I just wanted to get what he would say, and he said, من أجل الصمدية, one of the attributes of God is Samad, is, you know, قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد, and you know, it's Samad we usually translate it as what is it?
Perseverance?
No.
It's supposed to
How
be
is
like
how's
something
it translated to Fatha? Samad. Steadfast? No.
Yeah, but the samad isn't samad like a rock, like a block that cannot be divided.
It's stable,
Yeah.
something constant, something dependable, something solid, something strong, right? And I really like that response because one of the basic things of fasting is that it is, it is an intensive month of training. In, you know, we often talk that we are beyond just the material. We say that we can transcend our material dependence on things. But it's easy to say, and it's for some lucky few, they might actually practice it. But in Islam, it's a forced methodology of practice during an intensive month. Now, I'm talking about if people do it right. So, in fact, and that is why it's also in that month. I mean, I actually, in the khutbah I talked about 7 things that are inconsistent with fasting, and they go hand in hand with the practice of fasting. And among the 7 things, I mean, I've always been intrigued by the 7th, that filling your stomach, or eating, overeating upon breaking fast, because it's inconsistent with the entire rigorous agenda of practice during Ramadan, that you actually can forego your dependence on food and drink, and the challenge of, while doing so, intensifying your dhikr. People think that the dhikr just means Salat al-Taraweeh, which, again, you could do Taraweeh without ever, while failing to do dhikr, because you do Taraweeh and you're thinking of, you know, whatever, you know, what you're going to eat once you get home. People do that, or, you know, or whatever people think of as they're praying. Or you can do Taraweeh and then it's just the beginning of true dhikr. But the real challenge to be in a state of dhikr while fasting. And that's the true challenge. But, so it is you know, as Imam Muhammad Ghazali used to say that each attribute of Allah is ethical state. And our attempt to attain an ethical existence is to try to achieve as many of these ethical states to the extent that we can. So, for instance, mercy. So we try to be as merciful as we can. Of course, understanding that we never come close to what is ideally desired, but, or alim, the knowledgeable. So we try to attain knowledge as much as we can. And among them, this is samadiyya, is that strength, that steadfastness of not being a wimp and, you know, wanting your food and wanting your drink, and if the food is not there, you fall apart and so on. So that is an intensive training, and it's that, and according to the Quran, Muslims were not the first to be asked to engage in that intensive training. Now we can get into these theological discussions whether the Christian fasting and the Jewish fasting are diluted forms of Abrahamic fasting, which Muslims believe is the fasting that they undertake. The fasting that we do is what we believe was the fasting of Abraham. And that this fasting was watered down. That's why I get, yesterday I came close to the state of being really annoyed. I was listening to that Syrian guy, Shahrur, Muhammad Shahrur, and he was on TV and he was pontificating about how he doesn't understand why Muslims are, he claims to be an Islamic scholar, far from it. And he claims to have original insights about things, far from it. He's an engineer, computer scientist that writes about it. Yeah, so he was saying that, oh, you know, Muslims are I know they interpreted fasting rules wrong. It's okay to drink water, it's okay to eat a little. And I said, oh my God, here we go, from the Abrahamic fasting back again to the diluted forms of fasting. I mean, as if history is bound to repeat itself. May God forbid. No, it's a rigorous boot camp training in what ideally we're supposed to be. Now this is one aspect, but the other aspect, of course, is that imagine if it's time to break fast, which is the reality of so many refugees, because I also teach refugee law, and there's nothing to break fast on. And I mean, I don't know. I don't want people to abuse this, but when I was doing the takfir stage, one of the guy we read and memorized Riyadh al-Salihin with, his name was Sheikh Fuad. I don't even remember his last name anymore. He had us abstain from food or drink for 3 days, so we know how it means to starve. I mean, his intentions were good, but I fainted by the 3rd day, and I was in school, and it wasn't good. It was sort of, my mother got really upset. And have I ever told you the story before? No. So my mother got really mad, and she said, you can't see Sheikh Fuad anymore. I got really angry at her. And,
Called her a kafir.
I didn't, but I yelled. I yelled, I slammed the door, and it's like, yeah, anyway. So that's one of the things we feel guilty about after your mother passes away. It's just like all the times that you were really a jerk. She was right. I mean, I passed out in school. Like the teachers said, you don't feed your child. Why, you know, you're starving him, and they wanted to tell without the tarbiyah, and of course they wouldn't have done anything if we were in Egypt at the time. But nevertheless, she just got really mad and said, why weren't you eating? Well, Sheikh Fuad said we can't eat for 3 days. It was just really anyway, history. But we do fast, and if you don't reflect upon the need, then you're missing the whole point of fasting. I mean, and that's why fasting is also the month in which we are supposed to give generously. That's why we fast. These are the two reasons. Anyone else? Have I missed any other reason?
The physical side also.
Yeah, I gave a khutbah about it yesterday.
We will post it on. There was Shri.
Yeah. So you were before talking about how if you want to test your Eman in your heart, see if you're still attracted to ugly things. So two parts. Number one, can you talk more about what Eman is exactly? And the second part is there also levels, and I kind of know the answer to this, but I want to hear more about it, where you get to when you're not able to discern what ugliness is anymore, or what is ugly might actually seem beautiful to you.
Okay, that second question, I you know, that you know, I hope you're not laying a mystical trap for me.
No, I'm not.
Okay. Because there is
Beauty in ugliness.
It's you know, the point where you can see all of creation, you truly see the beauty and the harmony and the balance of things. I mean, the higher stage of the Hallaj or Ibn Arabi or the Rumi reach, that's such a, I mean, I'm not going to talk about that because that's way too
Advanced.
yeah. I mean, Hallaj, when they were chopping parts of his body, he would yell out, Aziduni, Aziduni, you know, give me more, give me more. Who reaches that point? I mean, so I've stopped even aspiring to that. So I'm gonna talk about a second. There is there is never a point where you are not tempted by ugly things, because ugly things tend to appeal to our egos. And the nature of, I mean, if you want, you know the golden rule, do unto others as you would like done unto you. It's such a simple rule. It's been taught by all the prophets. It's every prophet that God has sent from Abraham to Muhammad and also the wise sages in every system of wisdom tell us the golden rule. But yet, and then we have John Rawls turned it into a philosophy of justice. Of course, he gave it the secular, so he made it a secular principle of justice without God. It's so easy to conceive of, and it is so difficult to actually implement, because to actually put ourselves, internalize the position of others, and to see in truth what we would like done if we were in the position of others or others were in our position, so the nature of ugliness is that it deludes us from that principle of justice. We indulge, and that is at the heart of so much ugliness. Now, if we are talking philosophically, we start talking about differentiating between types of ugliness and what we mean by ugliness. I was just using ugliness in the non-virtuous sense, in the sense of the lack of virtue, and specifically in the field of virtue ethics and virtue representing beauty and the absence of virtue representing ugliness. So now, the more your man is solid, the less you are deceived by the lack of virtue, and the less you are deceived into imagining that the lack of virtue can be possibly virtuous. Because it is like that state of Somalia, you are anchored into a stable enough reality that you can imagine being in the shoes of others and knowing if you were in the place of others, what would you want done? And it sounds so simple, but it is so difficult to achieve. Because think about how often we actually observe that principle. So that let's be clear that that's what we're talking about when because there are types of ugliness in which, you know, like for instance, cockroaches, are they really ugly, you know?
They don't have any control over it.
You know, I know, you know, yeah, it's exactly the I know a lot of say no. I actually, you know someone, it was an insect man, and he used to think insects are so beautiful, but you know, objectively they're not ugly. They're not ugly. They're I mean, flies might be different because there's a relationship between flies and the demonic that's sort of weird, but I'm not sure. I suspend judgment about that. I don't, because flies have, their eyes could be quite beautiful. Creepy, but anyway, don't take me there. I mean, that's what I so let's just stay to
I think I was also more trying to lead you towards speaking about the veils and what keeps us from realizing.
Oh no, that's a different halaqa. If I start on that, I'm not gonna stop. Then we'll be the veil, because the veils. Yeah, so I'll take your first question because I didn't answer that. The Iman.
Iman, yeah.
Did you say what is Iman?
Yeah, I know it means faith, but.
In Spanish,
I mean,
it means
of course,
magnet.
from a legal perspective, Iman is simply believing in God, and in the case of Islamic laws, believing in God and in all the prophets of God, and that Muhammad is the final prophet of God. And that's what, from a legalistic perspective. But of course, you don't mean the legalistic perspective. And there are levels and gradations of Iman that, of belief. I mean, from you know, a truly believing person would fear nothing and desire nothing, because they have achieved such a conviction in God that they believe that whatever comes, you know, at a minimum, God could have warded it off if God didn't want it to come. But none of us reach that level of faith, or very few of us reach that level of faith. We struggle to elevate our understanding of the magnanimity of the divine in our reality. Because if properly, I mean, I tend to, maybe it's because I also believe that aliens could abduct you or jinn could abduct you. If you truly understand the magnanimity of the divine, that you could evaporate instantly. I know.
Could evaporate.
You don't have to believe in this. But the majesty of the divine is overwhelming. It will overtake you and undo your molecules instantly. So it is impossible to fully absorb the majesty that is Allah, and the beauty that is Allah, and the luminosity that is Allah. But we can reach gradations of Iman that approximates that abstract possibility. I know you know what I'm talking about because we talk about this all the time, but is that enough? I mean, can I get a pass with that?
Yeah, you're excused.
We've been talking about this his whole life. You know, and I've gone through all his flights of insane thoughts throughout his life, so. All levels of it.
Just wait till Mito gets older.
Yes, I'm not looking forward to that.
Okay, I'll help us with that.
Maybe you
A
can
little bit.
answer his,
Payback.
do they know that you even went to Cyprus and hung around the
Well, now they do.
Okay. Oh, he didn't do anything in Cyprus. He even never went there. I lied. Ask him about it.
Hang around what?
Any more questions?
Sufis.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh.
So let's go audit and then.
To Sharif.
It's not a question as much as just, is it okay if you could just enumerate the 7 things for the fasting? I know you said you're going to be putting a
Actually,
video, just the
I might-
enumeration.
Said them yesterday.
I might have, I'll say them very fast. But,
Yes.
What time is it?
Oh, what?
25.
So
Nine.
sharp.
7:53.
We should guess them.
No, I think as I was driving here, I was trying to remember that, or as we being driven here, I was trying to remember them, so I might have. Okay, I didn't, okay, so the first is that lowering the gaze and, what is the word I asked you about yesterday? Lust.
Last.
And because lustful gazes can negate your fast. Lying, backbiting, maligning people can negate your fast. Kaf sama, or listening to evil talk and backbiting and slander can negate your fast. Kafu jawarih, you know, if you beat someone while you're fasting, or kick someone, or leave alone kill someone, I don't think if you could, might as well break your fast if you kill someone. There's no point to fasting. You know, it's insane that people don't think that that's obvious. But honestly, if you use your hands or your feet to commit evil while fasting, that's fundamentally inconsistent. So that was 5, I think. Huh?
Spine, is that?
No, that I included that under. I included that under misusing your eyesight, spy on someone, and 6 was the and let us taxir min al-ta'am, that not gorging yourself on food. That's inconsistent with fasting. I mean, of course, that doesn't. It's not a negation of fasting, but it's inconsistent with the state of ta'am. And the 7th is أن يكون قلب المرء معلقا بذكر الله. That while fasting, your heart must be in a state of dhikr. And if all you're getting, you know, of course, this is extrapolated from the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, that how many people fast and all they get from their fasting is the lack of food and lack of water, or lack of that, in other words, they denied themselves food and drink, but they didn't gain anything else from their fasting. And so if someone is fasting, and as we know many examples in our lives, and all they are is in a bad mood, and snapping at people and just impatient with people, and you know, and every time you try to tell them anything, they say, well, I'm fasting, that's my excuse. That's not a state of dhikr, that's not consistent with fasting. Fasting is supposed to be a rigorous act of self-discipline. So these were the 7 things. I said them with the khutbah, so I was more eloquent there.
Audit, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question regarding prayers and light or luminous. Would someone who only knows how to recite Quranic Arabic during prayers, in other words, Arabic is not his or her first language, still be able to receive the divine light for doing prayers correctly?
Yeah, you know, this has there are, wherever Islam spread, ibadah, the salah, yes, it's recited in Arabic. But wherever Islam took root as a native religion, Muslim natives generated volumes of supplications, dhikr, in their native language, whether it's Persian or Malay or then
Indonesian.
yeah.
It's Malay still the same basically.
No, I'm looking for the word that I'm
Jawi.
thinking of.
Baha'i.
Bahasa.
That's the one that I was. In every Urdu, I mean, think of how much poetry and dhikr is in Urdu. One of the things that I don't like about the modern Islamic discourse is it's as if they delegitimate these natural native expression of Islamicity. And that's the death of Islam, right there. So in other words, if your native language is English, you bet, like in the same way that there are volumes and volumes of supplications in Persian and Urdu and Malay and so on. American Muslims have to generate it in their own native language, English. And they can become, I mean, I attempted this in my own modest, humble way in the Conference of the Books to generate, although English is not my native language, but I wanted to give an example to Native Americans of how you can create a supplicatory Islamic linguistic expression in English. And that was, I mean, I think this is probably the first time that I say this in public, but that was one of my purposes in writing the Conference of the Books. If I was writing it in the way I thought about it, it was occurring to me in my mind, I wrote it in Arabic. And I would have loved to write in Arabic, and many chapters I actually wrote in Arabic and I never bothered to make them in English, to transform because Arabic's but of course, you know, I think that my experiment was a failure because no one else followed that example of, you know, and so, no, you have to worship God in your native language. I mean, say your salah in Arabic, but talk to God in the language that you are most comfortable with.
After the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in current Turkey between 1930s to 1950s, they started to call for prayer in Arabic, azan in Arabic, and they composed a Turkish version of azan and had the caller to, you know, use that lyrics, newly composed lyrics, if you will, which actually very close and true to the real Arabic wording of azan. But it's still on TV or on radio stations or everywhere, whatever it was the prayer time, it was this Turkish version of azan that was, you know, broadcasted. So how do you evaluate this? Obviously there was some anti-Ottoman policy, you know, promoted by Kemal Atatürk in order to secularize the society and so forth. But I don't submit to it at all. I mean, I think Arabic azan is probably the most beautiful
From jurisprudential
poem.
perspective, I don't. And we can. There's prayer and the adhan are too embedded in historical practice that I don't touch. In other words, I insist on they being in the language because they are as close to get to the language of revelation. Now, of course, we know that Iran is, but it is sufficiently embedded at a minimum to Bilal, I mean, and at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So, now, beyond that, though, I mean, again, I think it was a huge cultural loss that when the Arabic alphabet was changed, and whether it's in Indonesia or Turkey, and I think the gap between these cultures and the Quran was increased tremendously, and I think that's one of the true historical disasters, and because it also divided us as an ummah and our ability to connect with each other, and so on and so forth. But having said all of that, now my Ottoman sucks. I mean, it's been so many years since, but when it was good, reading the Rawhaniyat in Ottoman, it's like, it's so beautiful, it's so gorgeous, and that, so and again and again you find that when people come to this, to the faith, and with their own cultural expressions that of the pillars of Islam, it inspires them to generate a very, at the one hand, there's a common Islamicity to it all that we find from Persian to Urdu to Ottoman to, it has a certain nectar, a certain taste, but with enough diversity that it's just generous. I think I mentioned, I told you before that when I was, it was Indonesia where they had a Sufi group perform, that family, father and mother and daughter, and they did although I didn't understand a word they said, because but I found myself crying. It was so, just melted your heart, the way it was being performed. In the same way that I don't understand Nusrat, but I don't listen to him much now, but I remember in Texas, Nusrat Ali Khan, I used to listen to him all the time. The Rawhaniya, the spirit, would somehow just be imported to me or transplanted to me. And although I have no idea what Must Kalandar is, which he says all that must so on. But I loved it, and it elevated me, and that's what I just. I mean, of course, I have to admit there is a huge cultural gap, but maybe because I'm just a dinosaur. They told me that, well, American Muslims are doing it with rap. Yeah. I just, other than Sharif's rap, I love.
But by the way, your writing style in Conference of Books didn't go astray. I know a lot of people who are basing their writing of their sort of monajat, if you will.
Really?
Yes. There is a group called Salepo. I don't know if you're familiar with that. Yeah, I'll send some links. First of all, they know your obviously they know your writings, and they praise your writing, and also they sort of try to use your style in their.
Interesting. That's very good news.
That they are African American Muslims,
it's a nice
Eastern.
not a total failure.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. You called it failure. At least it's not a failure.
I don't know. Obviously, I mean, because you said that it didn't go anywhere, I wanted to let you know that it actually
No,
had a good
that's
influence.
actually that would I mean, that would warm my heart because I really, I mean, of course, again, it might be that rap is the way that people are expressing their spirituality. Matthew, sorry, why do I call you Matthew?
He looks like a Matthew.
Matthew, does he look anything like Matthew?
No.
I know Matthew, but he doesn't look anything.
You're trying to rap. It's rapping.
I was going to say, I know particularly for my generation and generations before, rap was the vehicle through which we got exposure to Islam.
Really?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like the first time I heard Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim was in a rap song by Nas, who's not a Muslim. Like this is it. So like it, so I don't know about necessarily about like prayer or supplication, but definitely in terms of offering exposure and a different narrative towards blackness was totally hip hop. At least I don't know if it's true so much these days with hip hop, but definitely like in the 90s and the 80s, like yeah, that was like if you wanted an alternative like message about blackness and even like religiosity, like a lot of times you would find these messages like embedded in hip hop.
Yeah, if I just add to that, like a colleague was talking to me about fasting, and he knew so much. He's like, yeah, because I listened to this rap group in LA. So I'm like, I've never heard of them.
So like you find in hip hop and in jazz, like there's a huge like Muslim influence, but a lot of, I mean I think most Muslims, especially in my age, we probably know about the hip hop, but they're probably less familiar with jazz. And I think it's part of the like the indigenization of like Islam through at least the Black American experience. To what extent that's being lost, I'm not really sure. I kind of think it's being lost, but that's just me.
I mean, it is.
Makes sense.
It's like what happens with it. I mean, that is fascinating. I mean, I would love to learn more about that. If you guys know of books that or research done on it.
Yeah, what's it? Delatzai is the guy's last name. He wrote a whole book about Islam and hip hop. I know his last name is Delatzai because he, well, I think it's his brother because his brother was a counselor at CAPS at UCLA, and I think his brother teaches at I think he used to teach at in Irvine UCI, or he still teaches there. There's a whole book about it. But yeah.
There's a new book, New Muslim Cool.
Yeah.
I've heard of that one. Yeah. Was that the guy who came in?
No, Kamaluddin was the one that we met. He was from Singapore.
But is it like the new Muslim? Is it using hip hop to express social frustrations, issues of identity, or is it expressions of spirituality, like dhikr type thing?
Are you talking about the book, or you're talking about the interpretation?
I'm talking about the phenomena it studies. If you've read it, I don't know if
I think maybe the first one, identity, more than spirituality.
Yeah.
It's ethnographic work, it's anthropology.
I mean, there's a sociologist, he's at UCLA, what's his name, the guy who was there when I spoke with Sherman, I should know, it's embarrassing, I forgot about the name.
Edward Curtis.
I think it was
Edward Curtis.
He's telling me that, well, he was asking me if, he made the comment that, well, isn't music haram among American Muslims? So they basically believe that music haram, and maybe that's why they haven't developed, which is another travesty.
They use spoken word instead, a lot of young people nowadays. But
I mean, is that why? Is it sort of
it's like poetry, but there's no like musical, like stringed instruments.
Because they believe music is haram?
A lot of a lot of people.
Yeah, but it's also a cultural thing. It's
Yeah.
also a culture that
I
was
think it's
that picked up
cultural.
from like a lot
Yeah.
of black folks because the spoken word thing is popular.
Yeah. But yeah, they do think music's haram, and the only allowed instrument is the duff, which coincidentally happens to be an Arab instrument.
I mean, how did Nusrat Ali Khan come to be, and how did the whole sitar and tradition and...
I asked them, I have no idea.
Innovations, bid'ah.
Oh,
Under the bid'ah umbrella.
Yeah.
Going backward.
You have to listen to Gene Squad, Professor. Have you listened to Gene Squad?
Please no.
Gene Squad?
Yeah, there's a
Please
Oh,
no.
is this
No.
hip hop
Please
from
no.
Canada.
No.
Is this like
No,
the
no,
people
no,
used to say,
Please no.
I'm a Muslim.
No. That's native Dean.
Yeah, they're really
It's a teenage group. Like I think they're based in like
In Canada.
In Canada, yeah, and like they make really cringeworthy songs about like one is like, oh, I dedicated this to my Muslim sisters, and like it was like.
But the
Yeah.
good thing with Gene Squad is actually this group is fighting against Wahhabism clearly in the music, because the Wahhabism condemn their music because hip hop is haram. Then they fight back against Wahhabism and Salafism using their music.
So they have a
And it's using hip hop. Using hip hop. For example, one of the music is about Sheikh Abu Dhabi. It's clearly condemning all Sheikh stupid thing in Middle East. The title of the song is Sheikh Abu Dhabi. Sheikh Abu Dhabi, Sheikh Abu Dhabi, all this funny thing in the Seriously, of course, some of the,
You should listen to one of them.
Yeah. Well,
Can you listen to one of them on your
Yeah,
telephone?
It could be the opposite too.
Yeah.
I would actually love to interview them in the Usuli Institute, like do what we did with Heather and with Khaled Baidoun. They got guts. I respect people who have guts.
But there are some hip hop artists that I know of who are actually Salafi. They say we're Salafis, but it's more about identity, and a lot of.
I am a Salafi. I mean,
But they're talking about the Wahhabism part of it. That's what they're referring to.
I mean,
It's just the hip hop. So it's just kind of a mixed thing.
There's a. Yeah, I mean, I think. I don't know if a lot of people that describe themselves as Wahhabis have never read Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, because Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, if you've read him, and he has lists of takfir.
Kitab al-Tawheed.
Yeah, the list of takfir that in the Kitab al-Tawheed. So, my first question, well, if you describe yourself a Wahhabi, do you agree with this list? And if you told me no, then I'd say, well, you're not really a Wahhabi.
May I ask a question?
Kitab al-Tawheed.
Are these young people, are they part of the group that consider themselves the 5%ers? Is that the same group?
Oh, well,
They're not?
so some of the early hip hoppers were definitely like 5%, but some are actually like Sunni Muslims, like what's the name of that group? Jurassic 5. Like they're like Sunni Muslims, but like no, not Jurassic 5.
Jurassic 5.
No, wait.
Thinking of
this is way beyond 5%.
Yeah, the 5%ers are like an offshoot of like the nation. So like, yeah, the nation like split 3 ways.
Wait, what's the? He called himself Allah.
That's the 5%.
That's the 5%.
Clarence 13X.
Clarence
yeah.
13X.
Yeah, that's.
How about Brother Ali?
I think he's regular Muslim.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of Hispanics and a lot of people just listen to his music
Yeah,
and
no,
they're influenced.
Yeah.
And they can work.
Yeah, he's a regular. He's
Yeah.
a regular
Your
Muslim.
brother Ali is actually Sufi.
Yeah, he's more the Sufi,
He's
exactly.
Sufi.
Brother Ali is more because
Barak
Jamal
Abdul-
Diwan, he
Barak
follows
Abdul-
Jamal
Barak
Diwan.
Abdul-
I like Cat Stevens.
He's actually really famous.
No, I met Brother Ali. He was here a couple months ago.
He's also Muslim. At least he went back to instruments. He stopped playing instruments.
It's
Yeah,
he returned back?
Yeah, a couple of years ago he stopped playing it since he only knew nasheed,
And
like
his son
only
also.
vocals, but then he turned back to the guitar.
I haven't heard it.
He said his son kind of encouraged him to return.
Well,
I met him, Jamal, and him 3 months ago. Yeah.
I wasn't there.
Oh, okay.
Thank you very much.
And they all get to follow
Okay, I'm officially
yeah, that's what they all like.
Thank you, everyone.
I'll be back.
Oh, yeah, no, it is Jurassic Park. Yeah.